Going live now.
Good evening, everybody. This is The Real Review, and I'm Huon Hooke, and this is our 10th The Real Review live Zoomcast. We're doing aromatic whites tonight, and there are more than 60 people online as far as I'm aware at this moment. We don't sell wine, as you know, but we do provide a cellar door-to-door service, which is where you can go onto our Real Review website and you can click on the relevant button and go through to that winery if you would like to order the wine that we're tasting. That's just a service to you. We don't take a cut or anything. We have heard that some of you have bought wine from the wineries, and so hopefully you've got a bottle or something there to join in with. If you haven't, then grab something similar or suitable and crack open the top and taste along, sip along at least. A little reminder before we get started that we are doing some live events now. The Bentley Restaurant Guide to Cellaring. We're tasting some old wines and some cellar-worthy wines on the 22nd of October at Bentley Restaurant in Sydney. So come along if you can. The format of tonight's tasting is that I will taste 2 wines online, then we'll do questions, then I'll taste another 2, a couple more questions, and so on, and we'll move through it that way. So tonight is all about aromatic white wines, and I'm wearing my flowery shirt, as you can see, in keeping with the floral theme of the tasting. Aromatic whites. What's an aromatic white? All wines that have an aroma are surely aromatic. Yes, but some of them are more aromatic than others. And those are basically the ones that we've got here, but plus a few others. All of the muscat varieties are very aromatic, and it's this muscat-like fragrance, which is due to chemical compounds called terpenes, which are in the grapes and therefore in the wine, which gives some white wines a certain kind of fragrant aromatic lift, which is very pungent and very intense. If you have any doubts as to what I'm talking about and you're not sure what it is exactly, grab yourself a bottle of Moscato, which is probably the cheapest and easiest way of finding out what muscat smells like. Crack it open and have a sniff, and you'll find that wonderful floral fragrance comes leaping out of the bottle, or out of the glass, hopefully. And that's what muscat is. There are many muscat varieties, or many varieties with these terpene compounds in them. The most pungent ones are Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris, when it's very ripe, is almost like Gewürztraminer in its pungency. And of course, the muscat varieties. But there are also Viognier. We don't have Viognier tonight, but Viognier can be a very, very fragrant, spicy, aromatic wine, a bit like, again, a bit like a Gewürztraminer. In Argentina, they have a famous variety called, yes, what is it called again? Torrentes. I often forget the name of it. Torrentes is a very fragrant, spicy wine. In Greece, they have Moscow Filiero. There's an Italian, there are many Italian types of muscat, but there's even a red one in Italy called Aleatico, which is really quite a delicious wine. And in Piedmont, there's Bracchetto, which is a sparkling wine, which is a bit like a red equivalent of Moscato. The muscat varieties themselves, Muscat Gordo Blanco, Muscat of Alexandria, Muscat Hamburg, Muscat Ottonel, Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain, Muscat this, Muscat that. There's lots and lots of muscat varieties. The best of them is a variety called Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain. And that means, petit grain means small berries. So generally speaking, the smaller the berry the variety has, the better the quality. It's a bit of a loose generalization, but generally it's true. The big fat grape muskets, which can be as big as that, Muscat Gordo Blanco, which means fat white muscat. It's generally a cask wine variety, not a terribly high quality variety. In Rutherglen, of course, they make the famous liqueur muskets, which are fortified and aged for a long time in barrels. And the variety, they call the variety there Rutherglen Brown Muscat, but it's just their local name for what is actually red Frontignac. So without further ado, we'll get stuck into the tasting. The most important aromatic variety in Australia is Riesling, of course, has been ever since I've been in the wine industry, which is 35 plus years. Now, of course, Pinot Gris is coming up very fast as a very, very important variety. It's much more prevalent in the vineyards than Riesling now already, but Riesling is generally thought of as being one of our highest quality varieties. Gewürztraminer, we have a Grüner Veltliner, but I'll talk more about Grüner Veltliner when we get to it. It's not, strictly speaking, an aromatic variety in terms of having terpenes in the grapes, but it can be quite fragrant. So these are generally cool climate varieties. Yes, Rutherglen produces a different kind of wine from Muscat, but the delicate table wines and the sparkling wines that are really, really good quality, they tend to come from the cooler climates. Yes, Gewürztraminer is from Tasmania. Pinot Gris is common in New Zealand now, and they make some wonderful wines in the cool climates there. First wine for the night is Naked Run, the first Riesling from the Clare Valley. Now, this is a variety that is well known to all Australians, Riesling. A beautiful variety, one of the longest aging white varieties, probably the longest aging of them all. I'll leave that there so you can see the bottle. And Clare Valley, of course, there is no region that has more runs on the board with Riesling than the Clare Valley. And this is Naked Run. Don't ask me why they call it Naked Run, but there is a silhouette of what looks suspiciously like a naked woman running on the label there. You'd have to ask the winemaker, Steve Baraglia, what is going on there. But he is one of three mates who are all working in the wine industry who decided to start this company called Naked Run. The others being Brad and Jamie, and Steve is their winemaker. Steve Baraglia's main job, his daytime job, is as the senior winemaker at Pike's Winery in the Clare Valley, which needs no introduction to anybody, I'm sure, who's interested in Riesling. They make fantastic Riesling at Pike's. Neil Pike is now retired, and he was, I guess, the chief winemaker. Now Steve is in the box seat, and he's been there for many years. This is his own label, or their label, but he is the winemaker, and it's a tiny production wine. It's not big. It's not a wine you will see in a lot of places, but it's a very good wine. He is a graduate of Adelaide University in winemaking and viticulture, and his family had a vineyard in Williamstown, and so he grew up on a vineyard. So vineyard, I think it was his father, was known as Aldo, and he makes a Grenache from the same vineyard that Aldo used to cultivate. 88-year-old vines. It's called Aldo's Grenache, which is really good. But we're looking at Riesling. How does it taste? Let's have a look at it. Very pale colour, as you'd expect. It's a 2020 vintage, so it's only a bit over 6 months old. And the aroma is wonderful. The aroma is clear, clean, and precise, and really bursts out of the glass. A lot of 2020s are still a little bit closed now. It's very, very early to be drinking them, but this wine is showing you it's good straight away. Not a problem. The aroma, dried wildflowers, touches of spice. There's a bit of lemon and lime there. There is all sorts of citrusy things, but lemon and lime are the main ones. And there are some blossomy characters there. I think if you walk through an orange orchard and smell the blossoms, there's a bit of that in there too. It's beautiful. Wow. Intensity of flavour is just wonderful. The precision of that wine, the length of palate, the seamlessness. It's got a beautiful line to it. What I mean by line is it doesn't have any dips. It is a continuous line of flavour from the beginning to the finish. And the harmony of the wine is excellent. Good acidity without being obtrusive. It's not obviously sweet, but it's not austere in terms of dryness either. I think it's beautifully balanced. It's an 11.5% alcohol wine, which is quite low, but that's the style that Steve was trying to make. It's this crisp, delicate, very precise wine, which will age for a very long time. 10 years, no problem. Maybe 15 even. We've scored at 95 out of 100, which is gold ribbon score. It's a top value wine because we think the quality price rapport is particularly good. It's only $24 a bottle. And this is a top rank wine. So it's number 2 out of 20 different Rieslings from the Clare Valley from the 2020 vintage that we've already tasted. And I'm sure there's going to be many more. But that's an excellent wine. We're saying drink it for at least 10 years. And we ask, of course, the winemaker every time to nominate a food match that they would like to have with their wine. Steve Bragley has suggested freshly shucked oysters, and being where they are at the Clare Valley, I would suggest they probably should be Coffin Bay oysters because they're local. The other thing is King George Whiting, and that's excellent too. I think that's one of the classic matches between Clare Riesling and food, the King George Whiting. So a beautiful wine. Gosh, it pains me to have to pour that out, but I'll definitely try some more later with my dinner. Moving on to wine number 2, which is the Swinney Riesling from the Franklin River district of the Great Southern region in Western Australia. Now this wine, regular watchers will know that we tasted a Swinney wine very early in this series of webinars. The Swinney people have been growing grapes down in the Great Southern for a while now, not very long, but the current generation planted the vineyard. The family has been in this district, the Franklin River district, since 1922, so it's an old family. They're a farming family. They've been graziers, croppers, no doubt, and the 4th generation is now running the show. That's Matt and Janelle Swinney, and they have, since Matt and Janelle have been running the place, Janelle is Matt's sister, they have made a concerted effort to boost the brand and to create much better wines and get them out into the market more. And they have, I think, really hit the nail on the head. They've got Robert Mann as winemaker now. They've got a very good viticulturist. They've got very good advisors working for them, and they know what they're doing anyway. They're very good grape growers, and the wines have hit another level, I think. So they're really, really smart wines. So let's have a taste of it. A pale colour. That's the first thing I noticed. It really is pale. And that's no doubt because, I mean, it is a 2020. It's very, very young. But it's even paler than the Naked Run. It's a colder climate than Clare. The wines tend to come on more slowly. They develop more slowly. They need more time before you drink them, ideally. This wine ideally should leave at least another 6 months before you open it, I think. But the aroma is already beautiful. The aroma is quite high toned. There's passion fruit, lemon, lime, but there is this very lifted floral thing to it. It's not quite muscety in the sense that some Riesling can get muscety in very cool climates, but it is it's a gorgeous aroma. The intensity of that wine is very good. It has that wonderful combination of delicacy and intensity, which doesn't matter what wine you're talking about. That's a winning combination for me. You don't want coarseness. Delicacy is the opposite of coarseness. Delicate, refined, subtle, but intense, with this terrific line and precision that runs right through the palate. Good acidity, but not obvious acidity. Still tight, a little bit in its shell still, needs more time. I would keep that for at least 6 months before I drink it. We recommend to drink it from 2020 to 2030, 2022 to 2030. So saying give it 2 years, but I think give it at least a year. We've scored it 94 out of 100, so it's close to being a gold ribbon, very high silver ribbon. It's a top-ranked wine. It's rated number 8 out of 54 Rieslings from across Australia from the 2020 vintage that we've already tasted. So a very high-ranking wine. $33 a bottle, really good value. We asked Rob Mann. Rob Mann, of course, was a winemaker at Cape Mentelle in a previous part of his life, and he is the grandson of Jack Mann, who had 50-something vintages before the mast at Hortons in the Swan Valley and is one of the most famous winemakers of Australia. So Rob's got wine in his blood. He is a very good winemaker. We asked him what he would serve with it, and he says grilled scampi or fresh caught marron on the half shell with Café de Paris butter. What a good combination, and it's local as well, because the marron is found naturally in the southwest of WA. They farm it there now, of course, but it is a beautiful shellfish, and I think that's a great suggestion. So, okay, moving on to a couple of questions now. Leo Muggleton. G'day, Leo. Why do some Riesling producers age them in wood? I think probably because they're looking for extra texture. They're not looking for wood flavour, that's for sure. If you can taste the Riesling and you can taste oak in it, there's something terribly wrong there. It shouldn't taste oaky. Some wines can get away with a bit of oak character, but Riesling, it really ruins Riesling, I think, to have oak flavour. What they're looking for is the texture, and if you age wine in barrels, especially large old barrels, it doesn't get oak flavour. It will get extra textural roundness because of this very, very slight oxidative effect of aging in barrels. And of course, it adds a little complexity to the wine, of course, too. I think that that is traditional in places like Germany and Austria because there's a tradition there, because before stainless steel was invented, of course, everything was in wood or concrete. Wood before the concrete, and maybe clay as well. But those sorts of wines, there's a tradition there that's being revived. Victoria says, do the Europeans produce dry Rieslings like Australia? You bet they do. In Germany, generally the Rieslings are a little bit sweeter. They're generally off-dry, but it depends which region in Germany. If you're looking at the coldest regions, such as the Mosel, Saar and Ruhr, those are the coldest regions where Riesling is grown, and they tend to be a sweeter wine because the acidity of the grapes is very high. And traditionally, the acid was so high, the only way they could balance it, apart from picking them as ripe as they could, was to leave a bit of residual sugar in the wine. And that's, but of course, there are Trocken styles in Germany, which are near enough to dry. Trocken means dry. It's not always bone dry, but there are rules relating to it. Yes, Alsace produces dry Riesling too, and so does Austria. So there's plenty of that around. We'll move on now to the number 3 wine, which is Bream Creek. So we're really crossing the country here. We've gone from the Clare Valley in South Australia to the Franklin River in the far south of Western Australia, and now we've come back to Tasmania, to Bream Creek. And Bream Creek is a quite interesting vineyard. It's one of the oldest vineyards in Tasmania. Whoops, I'll put it there. Bream Creek was established in 1974, and the current owner, Fred Peacock, who's one of the great viticulturists in the country, and certainly knows as much about grape growing in Tasmania as anybody does. He didn't buy it until 1990, so it was already, the original vineyard was already well established by then, planted in 1974. This comes from the original plantings. So this is the Old Vines wine from Bream Creek. Bream Creek Old Vine Reserve Riesling 2018. And as I said, 1974 planted vines. I don't think there's any vineyard in Tassie with Riesling that's older than that. Marilla probably has some very old Riesling vines as well. So Fred Peacock, the vineyard is East Coast nominally, but the East Coast is normally thought of as being that area around Swansea and up to the Freycinet Peninsula, that beautiful part of Tasmania. But this one is down further south. It's further towards Hobart. If you drove from Hobart towards Port Arthur, just before you get to Eagle Hawke Neck and onto the Tasman Peninsula, you would pass the Bream Creek Vineyard. It's on. It looks out over a bay, which is called Marion Bay, and Marion Bay was where Abel Tasman first landed in 1642 in that bay to collect some water and plant the Dutch flag. And in 1772, the French navigators came along as well and anchored in the same bay. Fred, of course, is a little bit later coming along, but he nearly lost his vineyard, interestingly, in the 2013 bushfire. 2013, this terrible bushfire went through that part of Tasmania, and it went through the town of Dunalley, and I'm sure you remember the terrible scenes from there. And Fred thought he was going to lose his vineyard because the fire came over the hill and it only missed his vineyard because of a wind change. He was very, very lucky indeed. So Bream Creek is that area. It's a significant vineyard, and Fred also takes grapes from other vineyards that he manages in the Coal Valley. He doesn't make the wine himself. He gets it made for him by Winemaking Tasmania, which is the biggest contract winemaking company in Tassie. He's never had a vineyard. He's never been a winemaker. He's a man of the dirt, a grape grower. He trusts other people to make his wine, and they do a very good job, especially with Riesling. Riesling is fantastic from Bream Creek. So let's taste this wine. And this is a 2018 vintage, so it's already got 2 and a bit years on it. And the colour is almost as pale as the 2020 wines we've just tasted. And that's because 18 was a great vintage, and great vintages age slowly, and it's from a cool place in the country, Tasmania, southern Tasmania. So yes, wines do age slowly. Let's have a sniff. Beautiful nose, and an absolutely riveting mixture of lemon curd, musk, floral fragrances, potpourri, but also dried flower heads. You get all sorts of alluring aromas in that wine. It's beautiful. There's a touch of paraffin wax as well, which tends to come into these wines with a bit of age. It hasn't yet become overtly toasty, but it will eventually. Let's have a taste. Yep, and that's a gorgeous wine. It's very fine, very energetic, very precise, really, really good length to the palate. And still delicate. That wine has not fattened up, hasn't blown out. Some wines, white wines, do become broader as they age. This wine is, I think it's going to keep its tightness, its focus, and its precision for a very long time. It's a gorgeous wine. It's almost dry, but it's not austere. We've scored it 96 out of 100, so it's a high gold ribbon score. It's a top-ranked wine. It did very, very well in its category. It's number 2 out of 57 Rieslings from Tasmania of the 2018 vintage that we've tasted. So number 2. It's pretty hard to do better than that. We've suggested drink it now till 2026, but I have no doubt it'll last for 12 to 15 years, that wine, without a problem. $48. It's not cheap for a Riesling, but it is a particular rare selection of old vine Riesling. It's a limited production wine, and it's also got the extra age on it. So that's all contributing towards that price. The food match, Fred Peacock has suggested that caramelized pork belly braised in star anise with a salad of lychee, orange, and watercress would be his choice. He's obviously had that. In fact, he did have that in a Brisbane restaurant that he's nominated. But I think it's interesting that he's mentioned lychee, because lychee is very much one of those muscat-type fragrances that you get from, especially Gewürztraminer, but also occasionally from Riesling. Gorgeous wine. Put it back in its place, and we move on to the last of our 4 Rieslings, which is also a wine with a bit of age on it. It's 2019 vintage. And we're going back towards the great southern of Western Australia here to Plantagenet, which is, sounds like something out of merry old England, doesn't it? Henry VIII was a Plantagenet. The Shire, in fact, of the Mount Barker-Franklin region. Mount Barker area is where this comes from, not Franklin, but it's not far from Franklin, where the Swinneys are. Mount Barker, and that shire is known as the Plantagenet Shire, I believe. Don't ask me why it's called that. But the coincidence is that the man who established Plantagenet Vineyard, Tony Smith, was an Englishman who came out as a 10-pound pom in the early 60s, I think. In other words, he paid £10 to come out to Australia and migrate. He established the first vineyard in 1968, and Plantagenet now has several vineyards, and they're not owned by a family anymore, not by the Smith family, but they're owned by a Perth-based liquor distribution company called Lionel Sampson and Company. But they're still making excellent wine. The winemaker is Luke Eckersley, who is a local boy. He grew up at Harvey, which is sort of on the way down south from Perth. But obviously a trained, educated guy who's got a Bachelor of Science in Enology and has worked in wineries and other places before he came home to take up the job at Plantagenet. So how does this wine taste? Well, the first thing is that it is still a very light, almost pale colour again. So, you know, these are top wines and they do age slowly. This is a pale wine and it's got its whole life ahead of it. A different spectrum of aromas here. I get more of the citrus pith and citrus zest characters. There's mandarin, there's lemon zest, even maybe a touch of grapefruit. There's gardenia, there's a touch of honey, and it's very lifted. There's almost a Germanic fragrance to that thing. It's quite lifted. In other words, they're high-toned aromas that come off that nose. They're cool climate. That's a product of cool climate grapes. Try that. Try the wine in the mouth. And that's a really fine, delicate, restrained, but intense wine with absolutely pristine Riesling characters. They do several Rieslings at Plantagenet. This is called the Angevin or Angevin. Angevin. I'm not sure how they pronounce it. If you're French, you would say Angevin. It could be the angel's wine. I'm not sure what they're meaning by that, but it's a beautifully delicate, fragrant, hauntingly fragrant wine. Crystalline purity, beautiful, delicate wine. It's got a lick of sweetness in there, but the acidity which comes through at the end of the palate cleans it up and leaves you with this refreshing dryness, which makes you want another sip and makes you want to have food with it. 95 out of 100 is what we scored it, which is a gold ribbon score. We've said drink it now until 2030. Again, 10 years, nothing. It'll last for longer than that, but 10 years would be the drinking window. It's $32, not expensive. It's about right for a high-class Riesling. It's a top-ranked wine. We've it rated number 2 out of 17 Rieslings from Mount Barker from that vintage, 2019. So number 2 is pretty good going. The food match, we asked Luke Eckersley to nominate his preferred choice of food with it. He said fresh natural oysters, and he mentions in brackets that in their tasting room at Plantagenet, they serve Albany rock oysters. Albany, of course, is a little bit further south from the Mount Barker area of WA, not far. It's on the coast, Albany, and that's they apparently get good oysters there. And I would think that's a perfect example of the wine to have with the food to have with this wine. So well done to Luke Eckersley and the Plantagenet mob. So that's 4 wines we've tasted, and we're going to have a couple more questions now. Mark Pryor says, "G'day, Mark." He says, 10 to 20 years ago, Australian Rieslings developed a Kero nose as they aged. They don't do it any longer. Why is that? Well, some of them do, Mark. but generally that character is frowned upon by winemakers and wine judges. And the reason is that it's not that attractive. A little bit's okay, but generally not. But the main reason is that it's symptomatic of problems with the viticulture. The main problem is that things got stressed, the vines got stressed and their leaves dropped, and that it left the fruit exposed to the sun. And the hot sun, hit the grapes, which you don't want, and it left this character in the grapes, which sometimes I can remember the long chemical name of this compound that is responsible for the kerosene character. TDN is the abbreviation of it, but it's generally a product of grapes that got exposed to too much sunlight. So one of the great skills of modern viticulturists is to manage the vineyard so that there's just enough leaf cover over the bunches. You want plenty of light, but you don't want direct sunlight when it's really, really hot. So in a warm site, the western sun, which is the late afternoon sun, you want to avoid that hitting the grapes. So manipulation of canopy is what it's all about. Albert Hill says, considering the scores are pretty consisting, I think he means consistent, is the price difference justified? I wouldn't take too much notice of that. They're not all tasted side by side on the same date at the same time. So of course you will find minor variations in scoring. I don't have a problem with that. The fact is that they all rated very highly, and I've already mentioned the reason that the Grim Creek is dearer, because it's a rare old vine selection and it's a bit older. You do tend to pay a premium if the wine is released a bit older. And of course, reputation. I mean, if you had Geoffrey Grossett's wine, his wines are generally higher priced than everybody else's because of his great reputation, which is a well-earned reputation. So I don't have a problem with that. Moving on to the next two wines, and how are we going for time? We're going okay. The next wine is the black sheep, can I say, in this lineup, because it's not a particularly aromatic wine, Grüner Veltliner. Grüner Veltliner is the most famous white variety in Austria. They do grow a lot of Riesling in the same vineyards as where they grow Grüner, but Riesling's grown in many regions of the world, Grüner Veltliner not so much. So this is very much a grape that's associated with Austria. It's not a particularly aromatic grape. In other words, it doesn't have the muscat spectrum of aromas. What have we got it in here? Because frankly, we liked it and we wanted to give a bit of counterpoint to the whole deal. It is an aromatic wine, but it's not aromatic in the sense of muscat aromatics, terpene aromatics. Really interesting that Grüner Veltliner has found a home for itself in the Adelaide Hills. And there must be around about 25 producers. I think there's at least 25 producers of Grüner Veltliner in the Adelaide Hills today. And it's only been there for, less than 20 years, I think. Harndorf Hill is the most famous producer, and they're doing great things with it. Harndorf Hill just won the only gold medal, beating all the Austrian wines in the recent Decanter World Wine Awards. So good on them. This wine is called the Pawn, the Austrian Attack Grüner Veltliner 2019. It's from the Adelaide Hills. So this is one of those 25 plus wines from the Adelaide Hills. It is produced by a fellow called Tom Keelan. Tom and his wife, he is the grape grower. She is the winemaker. Rebecca Wilson is her name. And Rebecca's daytime job is the winemaker at Bremerton, which is her family company in Langhorne Creek, not too far south from the Adelaide Hills. He grows the grapes, she makes the wine. And they make wine for the Pawn Wine Company from Adelaide Hills and Langhorne Creek grapes. But they're tiny, limited production wines. They're a bit rare, they're a bit hard to find, and they do things differently to differentiate what they do from the Bremerton wines. The two shouldn't be confused. Why do they call their company the Pawn? Well, Tom apparently had a big crop of fruit hanging on the vines one year, and it was committed to be sold to one of the big wine companies. They pulled out at the last minute and said, we don't want your grapes anymore. And he felt as if they dudded him. And he then started saying that we're just little growers, we're just pawns in the game of the big wine companies. And they decided that from that moment, they would not waste the grapes, they would make some wine from that fruit and they would sell it under their own label, which is the Pawn Wine Company. So he's, apart from being the pawn in the game of the big companies, he's taken the chess theme to the limit, and every wine is named after a chess move. So there are things like the gambit, there's the en passant, there is the jeu de fin, there are all these, the Sicilian defense, there is, and this one, the Austrian attack, which apparently is a chess move. And of course, it's the obvious thing to name your Grüner if you're a chess fanatic. So a little bit obscure, but the wine is very good. Let's have a taste. Again, a pale colour, pale sort of straw colour, this one, not particularly yellow. And the aroma is classic Grüner Veltliner to me. It's like, someone once described Grüner, a young Grüner, as being like white pepper ground onto cucumber, a slice of fresh cucumber. There is that almost, not quite green, but fresh herby character of the cucumber, if you like. But also the white pepper thing is very much a feature of Grüner Veltliner. Lemon rind, certainly a touch of that, a bit of pear, and a touch more spice, a bit of cinnamon perhaps as well. But all of these things are in very, very delicate amounts. The wine is very restrained, fresh, delicate. The sort of wine you can drink a lot of without becoming overpowered by it. The palate, again, restrained, delicate, but intense. And it has those flavors, especially the pepper, the lemon rind, the dried herbs, the really, really a particular flavor. That's the word I was looking for. It's an interesting variety, Grüner Veltliner. It is a very adaptable variety. This wine is dry, but it's not austere in any way. The acidity is absolutely seamless and beautifully balanced. And because it's such a delicate, easygoing sort of wine with this dryness to it, it goes beautifully with food. I remember going to a wine and food matching session once. It was actually in China, Chinese dishes with Western wines. And the best wine that went with the most dishes out of the Chinese lexicon was champagne. But the second best wine out of everything else that we tasted was Grüner Veltliner. So when Tom Keelan says the food match is anything, he didn't nominate a dish, I know where he's coming from. Anyway, how do we judge this wine? We scored it 95 out of 100, which is a gold ribbon score. It's $26 a bottle, not expensive. We say drink it now to 2025, which is another 5 years. It'll probably last longer, but I think you'll get the best of it within those 5 years. And yeah, really can't argue with Tom at all when he says, and I quote, "It can be said that of all the great white wines, none does better with food than Grüner Veltliner." So well done, Tom. Excellent. So that's our modestly aromatic wine. Now we're moving into the most aromatic wines are at this end of the tasting, Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer. So Pinot Gris, this is a Kiwi. This is a New Zealand wine. Palliser estate comes from Martinborough, which is, as I'm sure you're aware, at the bottom of the North Island, not far from Wellington. In fact, if you drove from Wellington over a range of hills, a bit over an hour's drive from Wellington, you come to Martinborough. Martinborough was one of the first regions in New Zealand to really make the world sit up and take notice with its Pinot Noir. And the famous winery, Martinborough Vineyards and Atarangi, are both in the Martinborough district. It's a small region. Palliser was also one of the early people, the pioneers, established by the Ridderford family. Richard Ridderford, I remember well. He was a real promoter and a prime mover in that district. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. And I think the family either sold it or something happened, but it's now a listed public company, Palliser. This is the Palliser Estate 2019 Pinot Gris. And it comes from the Martinborough Terraces. So just outside, in fact, pretty much in the town of Martinborough, there is this terrace, which is an old riverbed that's been raised up so it's above the surrounding countryside. It's a flattish terrace covered with rocks. It's a shingle terrace, they call it in New Zealand. And a lot of these shingle terraces exist, and a lot of them have been put to good use growing wine grapes. And I'm thinking here of the Wairau River, which is Marlborough's most famous. Original area of Marlborough is a shingle terrace, which is an old riverbed. Parts of Central Otago are the same. In the Hawke's Bay region, the Gimlet Gravels is the same kind of thing, a shingle bed. The rocks, of course, mean that the soil is free draining. It's a very high rainfall country in New Zealand, so you need free draining soil. Otherwise, the vines get wet roots and they don't like that. So those sort of places become really quite prized for wine growing. The Waipara Plains outside Christchurch, where Pegasus Bay is located, that's another shingle terrace area. They're everywhere in New Zealand. So let's taste this wine. What else can I tell? I can tell you that that I have 72 hectares of vines, Palliser, which is quite a big amount of vineyard for a high-end wine company. They have 7 different plots of vineyard, and 3 of those, I think, are organic or in conversion to organic. So they're moving towards organic farming, very much so. Let's have a taste. So this is interesting. I was expecting this to be a big, rich wine, as a lot of New Zealand Pinot Gris is, and it's rich on the nose and rich in fruit and quite ripe and has a fair bit of residual sugar. This wine is not quite like that. It's an earlier picked style. It's not as spicy and opulent on the nose. It's got more a matter of ripe pears and ripe apples, a touch of honeysuckle, and some sort of chalky minerality to it. And when you taste it, there's definitely sweetness there, plenty of sweetness, but there's fruit to balance, and there's crisp acidity, which refreshes the finish and gives you a nice balanced aftertaste. Quite a straightforward wine. It's going to build more complexity if it's aged for a little while, but I think it's a beautiful drink now, no problem. We scored it 93 out of 100. Which of course is a high silver ribbon score. It's a top ranked wine. It was rated number 19 out of 111, would you believe? 2019 vintage Pinot Gris from New Zealand. So we tasted 111 of them and we rated this number 19. So it's pretty high rank. Bob Campbell rated this wine. He said, drink it now until 2023. Fair enough. I would say it could go for longer than that, but you'll probably get the best of it in the next 4 or 5 years. We did ask the winemaker, Guy McMaster, if he would like to nominate a dish to go with it, and he said Thai-style crispy pork or fresh ginger sticky pork stir fry. So what he's doing there, pork is the theme, obviously, but it's the Thai-style dishes, ginger, and probably quite spicy. It's almost a cliche that spicy wines go with spicy foods, and there is a definite spiciness to most Pinot Gris. This one is pretty mild in its spiciness, but it's also got a touch of sweetness, and sweetness tends to tame the fire in some spicy dishes. So if you've got a chili type dish, you need a slightly sweet wine or a beer. But we're talking about wine. And I think that would go very well indeed. So, thank you, Palliser. Lovely wine. Now, we'll move on to a couple of questions before we go the the final 2 wines. Susan says, are all Pinot Gris from New Zealand sweet? Not all of them. There are a few that are drier than others, and it escapes me right now which ones, but there definitely are. But I would say that nearly all New Zealand Pinot Gris have some sweetness, certainly the ones I've tasted. Generally, if you're looking for a drier wine in that variety, look for a Pinot Grigio. Grigio is usually drier than Gris. It's the same grape, of course, but a Grigio usually means a slightly lighter, drier, lower alcohol, earlier harvested version of Pinot Gris. And New Zealand doesn't do many Pinot Grigios. But generally speaking, that's a good way of finding the drier wines. Victoria says, no, she doesn't. She's passing on Chris Dibley's question. I have a few dozen high-pointed clear Rieslings with the kerosene character, including a 19 Red Robin and some Hanlon Hill Petaluma. The flavours are superb with these wines, but the Kero does need some getting over. I find it fades after a couple of hours in the decanter. Would you agree that air does eliminate the intensity of kerosene? That's an interesting question, and I frankly haven't tested that, but I will now that you've suggested it. Thank you for the idea. Aeration does moderate the bouquets of any wine. Yeah, it does. But whether it dissipates the kerosene character, the TDN character, if you say it does, I'll just have to salute and say, yep, okay, but I'll give it a try sometime. I think that's an interesting question. Generally speaking, the hotter, drier years produce wines with more Kero. The cooler years don't. And that's, again, partly to do with the amount of heat and sunlight that's hitting the grapes. Okay, moving on to the last two wines of the tasting. And we're coming to the spiciest two wines on the end here because, well, we tend to work up from the more subtle wines to the more richer personality wines at the end of any tasting. So what we're looking at here is Prancing Horse, which is a Mornington Peninsula wine. And I think anybody that's been following Pinot Gris in Australia would know that the Mornington Peninsula is the area which first distinguished itself for growing Pinot Gris. And the company that was behind that was Tegallant, which is now no longer a small family company, but is it's just a brand for Treasury. But the people that were behind it were Quealy and McCarthy, and they produced the Quealy wines from Mornington. They're still doing great Pinot Gris. A lesser known Pinot Gris producer is Prancing Horse, who has been producing good Pinot Noir and Chardonnay for some time, but Pinot Gris is a smaller part of what they do. They're probably going to become, I think, more famous for Pinot for everything in the future because their wines, in my view, are getting better and better. They're produced in the Red Hill area. So the nearest vineyard to them would be Paringa Estate. And it's on Paringa Road, which is only a couple of k's from the Paringa Estate winery. And yet the wines from Prancing Horse are completely different to Paringa Estate's wines. Part of the reason for that is that it's a cooler site. That's the main reason, I guess. And part of the reason it's a cooler site is that it faces Western Port Bay. So it's up over the other side of the peninsula from Port Phillip Bay. And generally the nastier weather comes in from Western Port Bay. That's the local folklore anyway. Tony and Kathy Hansey acquired a vineyard there in 2002 and they've added to it. And they've bought another property down the road and increased their plantings that way. And they've now got 13 acres of vineyard, 6 of which are producing grapes at the moment. So there's another 7 still coming on stream. Everything they do is estate grown. And the wines are made by Jeremy down at Muraduck Estate, Jeremy Magar. Which brings me to an interesting point. Tony Hansey says that his vineyard ripens, any given grape variety in his vineyard will ripen 2.5 weeks later than at Muraduck Estate, which is down in the lower altitude area at Muraduck, where the winery that makes their wines is Muraduck Estate. So that's a difference in altitude, the difference in the coolness of the site where Prancing Horse is. So you would expect that Prancing Horse to make a more delicate style of wine, whichever variety you're talking about. Higher acidity, lower sugar, lower alcohol, and a different spectrum of aromas. This wine is a sort of wine that that the peninsula is becoming quite famous for, which is a voluptuous style of wine, rich wine, full-bodied Pinot Gris. So what they've done here is let the grapes get really nice and ripe, and you get these spicier flavors. So the riper the Pinot Gris gets, the more like Gewürztraminer it becomes, and or the more like Viognier it becomes. It's very exotic in its spectrum of aromas. You got the lychee, the gardenia, the frangipani, those sorts of aromas starting to come out. Gorgeous, very spicy. And there is a little suggestion of barrel here. I suspect I've used some barrel, but just enough to augment the fruit character. And I already know, because of the viscosity of the wine in the glass and the aromas, that this is going to be a rich wine that fills the mouth. Definitely. That is a full-bodied white wine. So if you don't like lots of flavor in white wine, that's probably not your variety. But wow, that is an excellent wine. Lots of flavor, lots of richness, quite complex. And the texture of it is amazing. And I think we're getting back to that question earlier on. Barrel fermentation or barrel aging gives extra texture to white wines, as it does to red. The acidity is good, but you don't notice it because the wine is so nicely harmonized. When you taste that wine, you would not believe that it's 14.9% alcohol. Incidentally, when I see that on a label, I automatically assume it must be at least 15. Otherwise, why would they say 14.9? It's probably at least 15. And I've tasted plenty of Peninsula Pinot Gris that are more than 15% alcohol, and as long as they're in balance, they're very, very good indeed. So that's a gorgeous wine. And we scored it 93 out of 100. We've said drink it now to 2026. So probably not a long aging wine, but certainly will last quite well for a few years and possibly become more and more complex, more layered. It's number 7 out of 15 2019 vintage Pinot Gris from this district, Mornington, that we've tasted. So a pretty good effort, and it's $45 a bottle. We're looking at quite a rare boutique wine here. So that's an interesting wine to match with food. It needs richer food than the more delicate wines we've tried. So we've asked the winemaker, Jeremy Magar, what he would put with it. And he said calamari a la plancha, with romesco sauce, which is quite a strong, rich dish with quite a lot of flavor, salt and pepper. But he's also, and romesco sauce, which is quite spicy. But he's also said another possibility is piri-piri chicken. Well, that's a really quite a spicy dish. So we get back to this idea of spicy wine with spicy food. It's not particularly sweet wine, but you get sweetness from the alcohol and glycerol, which also has that firefighting propensity that residual sugar has. And so that would have good firefighting properties if you had it with spicy food. That's a wine I want to drink. It really is. I'm going to have some more of that later. So, Prancing Horse Pinot Gris. Finally, Spring Vale Gewürztraminer. Now, this wine is going to be the most exotic, the most hedonistic, the most out there wine of the tasting, which is why we've left it till last. And Spring Vale, I mentioned before that Bream Creek is in the east coast part of Tasmania, but it's not really on the coast, on the east coast. It's more towards Hobart. This one is the real east coast area, which is the Freycinet Peninsula, not far from towns like Swansea and Cranbrook. And Spring Vale is one of those old family-owned properties. It's been in the family, which is the Lyne family, L-Y-N-E. Rodney Lyne is the current owner. it's been in their family for a hell of a long time, since the 1920s. 1926, Rodney family came and settled there. And would you believe, exactly 160 years later, in 1986, Rodney established vines on Springvale. So a lot of the old family grazing properties along that stretch of the East Coast, and I'm thinking of Milton and Lisdillen and Kelvedon and Gala Estate, those sort of places, are all old family farming properties that go right back to the 19th century. And they all established vineyards in recent times when wine became fashionable. They're not entirely vineyards, they're mixed farms which just happen to have some vines, but they're doing wonderful stuff. So this is a beautiful, and so one sniff of that and you know what it is immediately. It just shouts Gewürztraminer. It's got this lychee kind of aroma, like, you know, freshly peeled lychee, you know, that smell. That's a smell of muscat, because it's the same terpene compound that gives its aroma to muscat grapes and to these grapes as they do to the lychee. So beautiful, fragrant nose. You could say it's almost like bath powder. It's like talcum powder. It's very, very intense and in your face. In fact, a lot of people object to having a wine that's as powerfully strident as that, but I don't. Let's have a taste. Spiced honey. Wow. And I'm thinking Tasmania, if you've ever had leatherwood honey, which is a specialty of Tasmania, it's got a touch of that to it. Leatherwood honey is becoming a bit expensive and a bit rare these days. They're knocking down too many of the leatherwood trees. But that is a complex, rich, full-bodied wine with power and resonance and length of aftertaste. It's not quite as high in alcohol as the Prancing Horse Pinot Gris, but it's still up there. It's 13.8%, which probably means it's 14. But you don't taste alcohol and you don't taste heat or astringency. It's got length, but lovely balance. And wow, that is a big mouthful of flavour. It's a wine that you could really sit down and nurse and enjoy for quite a while without getting bored. We asked Barry Cooey, the winemaker, what he would pair with that, and he said Northern Thai chicken curry. So from Northern Thailand, it's probably quite spicy. And again, it's a curry. So it's a Thai curry. It's going to have spice. It's going to have a lot of flavour. And he's obviously tried it, that combination. So I would say that that would be a great combination. So I think that we've come to the end of the wines, and I just need to have answer another question before I do what I really want to do, and that is actually consume a little bit of that. So Rod O'Connor has said, could a Riesling have a spritziness to it that I've noticed lately in a couple of clear Rieslings? Yes, in a word, it can. It depends. If the wine has been bottled with a little bit of carbon dioxide in it, it can have a little bit of a prickle on the tongue. You can pour it in the glass and you might see some fizz on the first pour, which dies down very quickly. And especially if it's got a screw cap on it, if the wine had a bit of gas in it when it was bottled, it will stay in the wine, probably for a long, long time. But the spritz shouldn't be a distraction. It shouldn't bother you. It shouldn't be so obvious that it concerns you. I don't think anybody is usually concerned by a bit of bubble in their wine. Most of us like bubbles. But yes, strictly speaking, still wines should not have sparkle in them. But a lot of people are quite happy to have a bit of CO2 in their wine because it helps to protect the wine against oxidation. So yes, a lovely wine, and got more yellow to it than this wine has too, because that's the nature of Gewürztraminer. It tends to produce wines with richer colour than, say, Riesling. It's also 2 years old, 2.5 years old, so it's not a young wine. It's starting to gather a bit of colour to it. We've scored at 94. I didn't say what we scored at 95 out of 100. It's number 1 out of 18 2018 vintage Gewürztraminers from across the country. It's a top-ranked wine. We've said drink it now and for 5 more years, and that's I think you'll get the maximum pleasure in that time. So I'm just about to close off, but there's one more quick question. What other Gewürztraminer producers are there in Australia? Oh, well, there aren't very many, I've got to say. The best ones are in Tasmania. There's a beauty called Waterton in Tasmania. I don't even know if they're still producing Gewürztraminer, but there's a handful of people in Tassie that do it. Piper's Brook, of course, are famous, always been famous for producing Gewürztraminer. There are a handful of others, like racking my brains. There's a good one in the Hunter Valley, which is by Little's. There are very few others, but usually you'll find Gewürztraminer in the cooler climates, higher altitudes. Delatite down in western, in the Great Dividing Range of the Mansfield area of Victoria, a high altitude vineyard, Delatite. They've always produced Gewürztraminer too. I haven't tasted it for a while, but it's usually pretty good. So, and Leo Muggleton, thanks Leo. Leo's reminded me that Topper's Mountain up at Inverell in northern New South Wales produce an outstanding Gewürztraminer. In fact, that's probably the one that I should have mentioned first, because it really is an outstanding wine. So moving on to the final comments that I need to make here, and that is that thank you for coming along, firstly, obviously. It's great to have your company. If you don't subscribe to The Real Review, we'd love to have you, so please do subscribe. If you want to buy any of these wines, as I mentioned, we don't sell them, but we give you a click through to the winery website, which is called Cellar Door to Door. And if you tune in on Thursday, the 15th of October, it won't be me, it'll be Stuart Knox, who's going to give you a webinar on wines to buy and drink for Christmas time. So that's the 15th of October, plenty of time before Christmas to get your stocks in there with Stewie Knox. Join in then, and don't forget, as I said before, the dinner that I'm hosting at Bentley on the 22nd of October, which is a cellaring wine. It's all about cellaring wines. So that's right on time. Thank you from me again, and please join us again in the future for our various events. And now that we're coming out of lockdown a little bit, we'll be doing more live events. Looking forward to that. Cheers for now. Good night.